For months, Prince George had stood at the center of a quiet but deeply personal royal dispute, with courtiers questioning whether his future education had been shaped by duty, parental ambition, or private rebellion. Then archivists opened a sealed correspondence file and confirmed something extraordinary. A private letter had already settled the argument, vindicating the young prince and exposing how badly his intentions had been misunderstood. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The confirmation struck with unusual force. George's education was never simply about classrooms or examinations. Every subject he studied, every friendship he formed, and every step towards military or constitutional training was being judged as evidence of the monarch he might one day become. A constitutional responsibility, meaning a duty connected to the rules and future stability of the crown, had been placed around choices most children made without fear. William and Catherine wanted their son to grow with balance, but senior courtiers wanted control, formality, and visible preparation. William stood beside George when an archivist placed the authenticated letter on the table. An archivist is a specialist, trusted to preserve and verify important historical records. The boy stared at the handwriting, then looked towards his father without speaking. His hands pressed together, as though he were holding back months of frustration. The prince placed one steady hand on his shoulder. Only then did George ask whether the adults who had doubted him would finally understand that he had never been trying to escape his future. Catherine felt relief first, then something much heavier. She had fought to protect her son's emotional stability, yet the letter proved how deeply others had misread that protection. The princess understood why the moment mattered. George had been treated as a future institution before being allowed to remain a child, and that pressure could shape not only his confidence, but his relationship with duty itself. She watched him absorb the vindication, and realized that success had arrived only after quiet suffering. The letter revealed far more than approval of a school. It set out a philosophy. Duty should be taught through understanding, not fear, and leadership should be earned before it was inherited. Charles received a documented account from the archivists, confirming that the warning against repeating the harsh educational pressures placed on early heirs was genuine. The king read that sentence twice, then set the page down without speaking. But the deepest shock was still concealed in the signature. Someone had written those words knowing the palace might one day ignore them. As relief spread through the room, one unanswered question changed the mood completely. Whose voice had reached across the years to defend George when the palace itself would not? Behind the constitutional language and carefully managed palace statements stood a young boy facing a burden few children could understand. George was not merely choosing classrooms, teachers, or subjects. Every decision was being interpreted as evidence of what kind of king he might become, leaving William, Catherine, and Charles divided over how much freedom an heir should possess before duty begins to consume his identity. George already knew his life was different. His classmates could imagine dozens of futures, but an ancient institution had already designed much of his adulthood before he was old enough to understand it. The crown, meaning the monarchy as both a family and a national institution, did not simply wait for an heir to grow. It watched, measured, and prepared him. That mattered, because every ordinary choice could become a public judgment, and every mistake could be treated as a warning about the future. William understood that pressure too well. The prince remembered being examined from childhood, with private emotions turned into public questions. He feared George might begin to connect royal duty with loneliness, constant observation, and the loss of choice. Catherine shared that fear. During one family evening, she noticed her son stop speaking the moment two aides entered carrying briefing folders. His expression closed, and the warmth left his voice. She realized the palace was teaching him caution before it had taught him confidence. Charles saw the danger differently. The king believed preparation could not be delayed forever because the monarchy depended on readiness, discipline, and service. Yet his sincere concern created distance. During a private conversation, he asked George whether he understood what would one day be expected of him. The boy paused, then answered, "I understand the duty. I just want to understand the world first." Charles heard respect in those words, but George feared his grandfather heard weakness. Catherine found him after dinner, unusually quiet. George asked whether wanting time beyond palace traditions made him selfish. She moved closer and told him that understanding himself would make him stronger, not less committed. The letter supported her completely. It drew a clear line between avoiding responsibility and preparing for it differently, arguing that George should understand ordinary lives before ceremonial expectations surrounded him. William then uncovered something more troubling. A documented archival note showed that the author had ordered the letter preserved separately from routine household correspondence, meaning everyday official letters and records. Someone had expected resistance. Worse, one senior advisor had already tried to replace George's approved plan with a stricter program. That answer should have ended the argument, but buried inside the palace records was evidence that the dispute had begun long before George ever spoke those words. The conflict surrounding George's education did not begin with the discovery of the letter. It began during one carefully arranged royal ceremony when a seemingly harmless conversation became a private confrontation. What happened that afternoon convinced William that his son's future was being planned without him, and convinced another member of the family that the palace was preparing to repeat one of its most painful mistakes. Senior courtiers had pressed for more constitutional tutoring, military history, formal speaking lessons, and supervised public appearances. Constitutional tutoring meant teaching the rules, duties, and limits attached to the monarchy. Visible preparation would reassure supporters that the future king was ready. William and Catherine understood duty mattered, but they refused to let every year of George's adolescence become rehearsal for a crown decades away. In their eyes, preparation without balance risked creating obedience without confidence. The point of no return came after a St. George's Day ceremony at Windsor. The ceremony honored England's patron saint, but the shock arrived afterwards. A senior household advisor handed William a timetable with residential military preparation, weekly constitutional briefings, and reduced time at home. Neither parent had been consulted. He read the pages, placed them back on the table, and asked who had authorized them. The advisor answered that the plan reflected the needs of the institution. William's expression hardened. The institution meant the monarchy as a permanent system, but George had been discussed like an asset rather than a child. He slid the timetable across the table, pushed his chair backwards, and said with controlled anger, "No one plans my son's childhood without speaking to his parents." George heard part of the exchange from the corridor. Later, Catherine found him folding and unfolding the ceremony program, pretending nothing had happened. She asked what he had heard. He avoided her eyes, then whispered that people seemed more interested in preparing a king than understanding him. Catherine felt the cost. This was no longer a dispute between adults. It had reached her son. Anne had witnessed the confrontation. She warned William that similar language had once justified separating royal children from emotional support in the name of discipline. She instructed a trusted archivist to search restricted education files, records kept from normal access, for guidance concerning future heirs. The search uncovered a catalog reference to a sealed personal letter. Before it could be opened, Charles learned about the search and demanded to know whether William was challenging the sovereign's authority or protecting George from an unauthorized intervention. The timetable had exposed the hidden struggle, but the next meeting would force father, son, and sovereign to confront what each of them believed duty was allowed to take. When William entered the king's private room at Windsor, he carried no briefing papers and brought no aides. Charles was already waiting, the disputed education timetable resting between them. What followed was not a constitutional discussion conducted through careful language. It was a raw confrontation between a father determined to protect his child and a monarch terrified that the future crown was being left unprepared. Charles believed the monarchy survived because every generation accepted preparation before comfort. The crown, meaning the institution of royal authority, passed from one sovereign to the next, demanded readiness long before power arrived. To the king, George's education was not only a family decision, it was a duty owed to the country, because an unprepared heir could weaken public trust. William saw the same risk differently. He believed training without emotional security created resentment, not service, and he refused to let fear become his son's first lesson in leadership. Charles accused William of allowing the wounds of his own childhood to shape George's future. The prince did not retreat. He answered that those wounds were exactly why the system could not be repeated. Then the argument turned personal. William revealed that George had begun wondering whether his grandfather considered him weak. The king's composure broke. He looked away, shaken by the thought that protection had been received as rejection. William leaned forward. "You are asking him to prove he can carry the crown before anyone has proved the crown can protect him." Charles gripped the arm of his chair but did not interrupt. Instead, he removed his glasses, folded them slowly, and asked whether William truly believed the monarchy had harmed him. The future king answered, "I believe it loved the role before it understood the boy." William then disclosed the archivist's documented finding. A sealed letter approved George's broader education plan. A sealed letter was a private document, formally closed and preserved to protect its contents. Charles recognized the archival reference immediately. He admitted that he knew guidance existed, but had believed it was advisory, not binding. That confession changed everything. The palace had not simply forgotten the document. Someone had chosen not to consult it. Anne entered before either man could speak again. She carried written authentication, confirming that the signature was undisputed and that the instructions could override the advisor's program. Charles studied her face, while William watched the folder in her hands. The confrontation had exposed their fears, but the signature would now decide whose judgment carried authority. Neither man left the room victorious, because Anne was carrying evidence that would shift control away from personal opinion and towards a promise the family had nearly broken. The letter's contents were moving, but its signature transformed a family argument into a royal reckoning. The words had been written by Queen Elizabeth II during the final phase of her reign, after private conversations with William about George's future. She had not left vague advice. She had created a deliberate educational framework and warned that institutional anxiety must never be allowed to overwhelm the child. Anne carried the document into a small archival chamber where Charles, William, and Catherine were waiting. An archival chamber is a secure room used to protect important historical records from damage or interference. The princess began reading aloud, her voice steady until she reached one devastating line. "George must always be remembered as a child before he is an heir." She paused. No one interrupted her. The silence carried the full weight of what the late queen had feared. Elizabeth had watched generations of royal heirs endure rigid training, public scrutiny, and emotional distance. Her reign had taught her that continuity required strength, but pressure alone could not create strength. It could create obedience, resentment, and fear. That distinction mattered because George was not simply being prepared for ceremony. He was being shaped for a lifetime of service, and the wrong kind of preparation could damage the very loyalty the monarchy hoped to preserve. Catherine quietly wiped away a tear when Anne read the paragraph praising her and William for giving their son a secure home. The recognition struck deeply. Choices once dismissed as overprotective were now confirmed as part of the Queen's plan. William lowered his eyes, while she pressed her fingers together, realizing that years of private doubt had finally been answered by the one voice palace officials could not easily dismiss. Charles felt the words differently. The king heard guidance, but he also heard criticism. His mother had clearly feared that palace machinery might become too forceful after her death, especially when anxious advisors confused control with protection. Anne placed the letter before him and turned it towards the signature. He traced the familiar handwriting with one finger, closed his eyes, and admitted that the proposed timetable could not proceed. The final paragraph made the decision unavoidable. No major change to George's education could occur without the agreement of both parents and direct consultation with the child. Archivists confirmed through a documented memorandum that the letter had been catalogued, witnessed, and formally preserved, giving it authority far beyond casual advice. George had finally been vindicated, but the confirmation brought a harsher question into the open. Who had decided that the late Queen's warning could be ignored? Vindication did not bring immediate peace. It triggered a rapid internal reckoning, as the proposed education timetable was withdrawn. Meetings were cancelled, and senior officials were summoned to explain how a protected royal instruction had been bypassed. For George, the change offered relief. For Charles, it revealed a dangerous truth. Members of his own household had acted with confidence they had never been formally given. Charles ordered a restricted review of every briefing, recommendation, and meeting connected to the plan. The inquiry, meaning a formal investigation into how a decision was made, was limited to a trusted group so the family dispute would not become a public scandal. That mattered, because exposure could turn George's private distress into national debate, while silence without accountability could allow the same abuse of authority to happen again. The alternative timetable was suspended at once. Tutors, military advisors, and household staff were told that William and Catherine retained primary authority over their son's daily education. Catherine delivered the news quietly. George did not celebrate. His shoulders loosened, but his face remained guarded as he asked whether people would still blame him for causing trouble. Even vindication had left him afraid of adult resentment. She told him the trouble had begun when adults stopped listening, not when he finally spoke. Charles felt the betrayal personally. A senior advisor had taken his general concern about preparation and treated it as permission to build a harsher program. The king had wanted discipline, not separation. He had wanted readiness, not fear. Yet his words had been stretched until someone else's ambition carried royal weight. Anne then uncovered the most chilling detail. Beside the archival catalog reference was a handwritten note, not required for current planning. A catalog reference is the identifying record used to locate a preserved document. No signature appeared, but the message proved someone had found the letter and chosen not to retrieve it. She insisted the omission was deliberate judgment, not an innocent mistake. Charles summoned the advisor responsible. The official defended the timetable as necessary for the crown, but the monarch closed the folder and answered quietly, "Concern for the crown does not give you possession of the child." He removed the advisor from all matters involving the Wales children and ordered every future recommendation to go directly to both parents. The palace had contained the institutional threat, but George remained distant from Charles. William now understood that rules could stop another intrusion, yet only trust could repair what had already been broken. The palace had corrected the decision on paper, but only one private conversation could determine whether George believed the people around him had finally understood him. The palace had intended to keep the dispute private, but public attention changed when Charles and George emerged from Windsor walking side by side. The image contained no ceremony, uniforms, or rehearsed smiles. George held a folder beneath one arm, while his grandfather leaned towards him in conversation. Within hours, the photograph became the defining image of a royal conflict the public had never known was happening. Charles understood the danger immediately. The palace released a carefully worded statement, confirming that archival material had clarified the agreed educational approach for George, and that his development would continue under the joint guidance of his parents and the king. Archival material meant preserved letters, records, and official papers kept to protect the monarchy's history and decisions. That phrase mattered because it proved this was not a sudden compromise. It showed that a historic instruction had shaped a modern royal choice, giving the family a reason to change course without appearing divided. The next morning brought the explosion William had feared. The Chronicle Crown published a full-page cover showing the grandfather and grandson leaving Windsor beneath the headline, "The boy was right. Queen's letter defends George's future." Outside the castle, a small crowd gathered near the Long Walk, the broad avenue leading towards Windsor. One handwritten sign read, "Let him learn before he leads." The words spread because they captured why the moment mattered. George was not rejecting duty. He was asking for the knowledge, freedom, and maturity needed to carry it without breaking beneath it. William folded the newspaper and placed it face down at breakfast. Vindication should have felt like victory, yet the prince saw another burden forming around his son. Public sympathy could become expectation, and expectation could become another cage. George turned the front page back over, studied the photograph and said, "At least they understand I wasn't running away." His father heard relief in the words, but also the quiet exhaustion of a boy who had been forced to defend his curiosity before the country. Catherine softened the moment by showing him messages praising his honesty rather than questioning his commitment. George flushed with embarrassment, yet he read several twice. Then a broadcaster, citing a documented palace briefing based on the Queen's letter, revealed that she had praised his curiosity, kindness, and willingness to ask difficult questions. Those qualities had once been treated by rigid officials as resistance. Now they were being recognized as signs of thoughtful leadership, and that recognition would soon reach far beyond his classroom. The world had delivered its judgment, but the deeper verdict would be found in the changes George's letter forced the monarchy to make within itself. The palace had intended to keep the dispute private, but public attention changed when Charles and George emerged from Windsor walking side by side. The image contained no ceremony, uniforms, or rehearsed smiles. George held a folder beneath one arm, while his grandfather leaned towards him in conversation. Within hours, the photograph became the defining image of a royal conflict the public had never known was happening. Charles understood the danger immediately. The palace released a carefully worded statement confirming that archival material had clarified the agreed educational approach for George, and that his development would continue under the joint guidance of his parents and the king. Archival material meant preserved letters, records, and official papers kept to protect the monarchy's history and decisions. That phrase mattered because it proved this was not a sudden compromise. It showed that a historic instruction had shaped a modern royal choice, giving the family a reason to change course without appearing divided. The next morning brought the explosion William had feared. The Chronicle Crown published a full-page cover showing the grandfather and grandson leaving Windsor beneath the headline, "The boy was right. Queen's letter defends George's future." Outside the castle, a small crowd gathered near the Long Walk, the broad avenue leading towards Windsor. One handwritten sign read, "Let him learn before he leads." The words spread because they captured why the moment mattered. George was not rejecting duty. He was asking for the knowledge, freedom, and maturity needed to carry it, without breaking beneath it. William folded the newspaper and placed it face down at breakfast. Vindication should have felt like victory, yet the prince saw another burden forming around his son. Public sympathy could become expectation, and expectation could become another cage. George turned the front page back over, studied the photograph, and said, "At least they understand I wasn't running away." His father heard relief in the words, but also the quiet exhaustion of a boy who had been forced to defend his curiosity before the country. Catherine softened the moment by showing him messages praising his honesty rather than questioning his commitment. George flushed with embarrassment, yet he read several twice. Then a broadcaster, citing a documented palace briefing based on the Queen's letter, revealed that she had praised his curiosity, kindness, and willingness to ask difficult questions. Those qualities had once been treated by rigid officials as resistance. Now they were being recognized as signs of thoughtful leadership, and that recognition would soon reach far beyond his classroom. The world had delivered its judgment, but the deeper verdict would be found in the changes George's letter forced the monarchy to make within itself. The letter did more than settle an argument over schools, lessons, and royal preparation. It established a principle that the monarchy had often struggled to accept. An heir could honor duty without surrendering his humanity. George's vindication was not a victory over Charles, the palace, or tradition. It was proof that the future of the crown would depend on listening to the person destined to carry it. Charles acted quickly. He approved an education framework based on Elizabeth's letter, combining constitutional guidance, service experience, freedom, and royal training. A constitutional framework is the set of principles explaining how the crown works within Britain's system of government. George would learn those duties without being pulled from family stability, because preparation meant little if it destroyed the security needed to carry responsibility wisely. William and Catherine regained the authority they believed should never have been questioned. The palace confirmed them as the primary decision-makers over their son's schooling, while recommendations would include George's perspective before any change. The parents knew why that safeguard mattered. Without it, advisors could again confuse obedience with readiness. George stopped treating his desire for balance as something he needed to defend. Ordinary friendships, private interests, and difficult questions no longer stood against kingship. They became part of his preparation. Charles accepted the same truth during an apology preserved in a documented family account. The king admitted that protecting the monarchy sometimes required resisting its oldest instincts, and the boy understood that duty had not defeated affection. Anne moved quietly to make that lesson permanent. She ordered the letter cross-referenced within the Royal Education Archives, meaning future officials would find its principles attached to related records. The princess knew memory could be ignored, so she turned memory into procedure. The advisor behind the alternative timetable did not return to matters involving the Wales children, and the official's removal carried a warning. Parental consultation was now required for recommendations concerning young royals. Weeks later, Charles opened one family diary during a private history session with George. No formal tutors attended. The prince arrived with a notebook filled with questions, and his grandfather welcomed everyone. At the end, the monarch closed the diary and asked what subject they should explore next. George was not given an instruction. He was given a choice. The private letter preserved more than Queen Elizabeth's wishes. It protected George's right to become a king through wisdom rather than fear, completing a quiet royal victory that changed both a young prince and the institution waiting for him. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.